May 7, 1942. Twilight over the Coral Sea. The landing. Signal officer aboard USS Yorktown squinted into the gathering darkness as an aircraft approached the carrier. Something was wrong. The plane blinked its landing lights in the standard pattern, wheels down, flaps extended, preparing to land. But the silhouette was all wrong. That wasn't an American fighter. Before he could react, 2 more aircraft fell into the landing pattern behind it. Japanese bombers, circling his carrier. Their pilots, disoriented and lost in the darkness, had mistaken the Yorktown for one of their own carriers. They were trying to come home to the wrong ship. The deck erupted in gunfire. Tracers lit up the Pacific twilight as the Japanese pilots, suddenly realizing their catastrophic error, broke formation and vanished into the night. This bizarre incident enemy, pilots literally attempting to land on an American aircraft carrier, should have been a one-time fluke. A strange footnote in the history of naval warfare. But it wasn't. Because 1 month later and 2,000 miles north, something even more valuable was about to fall into American hands. Not just an aircraft attempting to land, but an intact, flyable Japanese Zero fighter, the most feared aircraft in the Pacific, and unlike those pilots over the Coral Sea who escaped into the darkness, this Zero would tell the Americans everything. What the United States discovered when they finally flew that captured fighter would shatter the myth of Japanese invincibility in the air. It would expose fatal design flaws that Japanese engineers had known about since 1940 but never fixed. And it would hand American pilots a roadmap for survival-specific tactics, precise maneuvers, exact speeds that would turn the tide of the entire Pacific air. But to understand how a single captured aircraft became what one Japanese admiral called no less serious than our defeat at Midway, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to when the Zero was still a mystery. Back to when American pilots had only one official strategy when engaged by Japanese fighters: run away. This is the story of how Japanese aircraft, through accident, misfortune, and one pilot's tragic final moments, ended up in American hands and changed everything. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, when the first wave of Japanese aircraft screamed out of the Hawaiian morning sky. American servicemen witnessed something that should have been aerodynamically impossible. Fighters that could outturn, outclimb, and outdistance anything the United States had in the air. Fighters that seemed to defy the fundamental laws of aircraft design. The Mitsubishi A6M0, designated Type 0, for the year it entered service in the Japanese calendar, had been designed with a single, radical philosophy: achieve air superiority through absolute maneuverability. And Japanese engineer Jiro Horikoshi had succeeded brilliantly. The Zero could turn inside any Allied fighter. Its range exceeded 1,900 miles, allowing it to escort bombers on missions no other nation thought possible. It climbed faster than anything American pilots had ever faced. In early combat over China, Zeros achieved a 12-to-1 kill ratio. Over Ceylon in April 1942, 36 Zeros engaged 60 British fighters and shot down 27 of them while losing just 1 to American pilots. It seemed like magic. Dark, deadly magic. But here's what American intelligence didn't know. The Zero's incredible performance came at a price. A price Japanese engineers knew about from the very beginning but accepted anyway to achieve that legendary agility. The Zero had no armor plating protecting the pilot. None. Its fuel tanks weren't self-sealing, meaning a single incendiary round could turn the entire aircraft into a fireball. The fuselage was so lightly built that it could barely withstand high-speed maneuvers. According to author Jim Reardon, the Zero was probably the easiest fighter of any in World War II to bring down when hit. But there was a fatal catch. American pilots didn't know any of this. And what you don't know can kill you. In 1940, a full year before Pearl Harbor, Claire Lee Chennault, leader of the Flying Tigers in China, had filed a detailed intelligence report about the Zero's capabilities. He described its strengths, its performance characteristics, its combat tactics. The report landed on desks at the United States Department of War. The analysts dismissed it as arrant nonsense. They concluded that the performance Chennault attributed to the Zero was an aerodynamic impossibility. A fighter that light, they reasoned, simply couldn't exist. They filed the report away. So when war came, American pilots faced an enemy they didn't understand, flying an aircraft that defied everything they'd been taught. The official United States Navy combat directive was brutally simple. If engaged by a Zero, do not dogfight. Disengage and withdraw. Translation: run away, flying ace. William N. Leonard later recalled, "In these early encounters, we were learning the folly of dogfighting with the Zero, learning it the hard way, with American pilots dying in burning cockpits because they tried to outturn an aircraft designed to do nothing else." By the spring of 1942, the Zero had become something more than just an enemy fighter. It had become a psychological weapon. Japanese propaganda emphasized the Zero's invincibility, and American losses seemed to confirm it. But warfare has a way of revealing secrets, and in May 1942, the first crack appeared in the Zero's mystique, not through intelligence gathering or strategic planning, but through pure, accidental chaos. The Battle of the Coral Sea, May 4th to 8th, 1942. This was the first naval battle in history where the opposing ships never came within sight of each other. Everything depended on carrier-based aircraft, and on the evening of May 7th, both sides had launched extensive airstrikes that were now returning in the gathering. Darkness carrier operations at night were always dangerous. Pilots had to locate their carrier, tiny moving speck in an ocean of darkness, using dead reckoning, radio signals, and desperate hope. Get it wrong, and you'd run out of fuel over empty ocean. On the Japanese side, the returning strike force was scattered, disoriented, and running low on fuel. Their carriers, Shaku and Zuikaku, were somewhere in the darkness ahead. At least, that's what they thought. What they actually found was Task Force 17, the American formation centered on the carrier USS Yorktown, at approximately 1900 hours. 3 Japanese aircraft approached the Yorktown from the port side. The carrier's Combat Information Center tracked them on radar. Pilots scrambled to the flight deck. Anti-aircraft crews tensed at their stations, but the Japanese aircraft didn't attack. Instead, they did something that left the Americans stunned and disbelieving. They entered the landing pattern. The lead aircraft blinked, its running lights in the standard signal. Wheels down, flaps extended. The pilot was lining up for approach, preparing to land on what he believed was his own carrier, for a surreal moment. Americans on the Yorktown's deck watched enemy bombers circling their ship, following proper carrier landing procedures. Completely unaware they were about to set down on an American flight deck, the landing signal officer, the man whose job was to guide aircraft onto the decks, stood frozen, waving paddles in his hands, watching an enemy bomber on final approach. Someone opened fire. Tracers arced across the darkening sky. The lead Japanese aircraft broke hard left, suddenly understanding the catastrophic mistake. The other two broke formation, their pilots, no doubt, experiencing the heart-stopping terror of realizing they'd been seconds away from landing among their enemies. Anti-aircraft guns hammered the sky, but the Japanese aircraft disappeared into the night. Miraculously, all three escaped. Aboard the Yorktown, sailors looked at each other in amazement. What had just happened seemed impossible. Enemy pilots trying to land on an American carrier. It was the kind of story no one would believe back home, but it had happened. And it revealed something crucial. Japanese pilots, for all their skill and training, could make mistakes, could be confused, could be vulnerable. The incident became a footnote in the larger battle of the Coral Sea. Tactically, it meant nothing. The battle itself ended in a strategic American victory Japans advanced toward. Port Moresby was stopped for the first time, but the Yorktown incident planted a seed. If Japanese pilots could be that disoriented, that confused, what other vulnerabilities might exist? The answer would come 1 month later, in one of the most desolate places on Earth. And this time, the aircraft wouldn't fly away. The Aleutian Islands. June 1942. If you wanted to design a landscape specifically to kill pilots, you'd create something like the Aleutian, a chain of 120 volcanic islands sweeping westward from Alaska into the North Pacific. Each one more inhospitable than the last. Barren, rocky, shrouded in fog 5 or 6 days a week. Violent winds, freezing temperatures, the kind of place where a crash-landed pilot could survive the impact and still freeze to death within hours. Military strategists on both sides considered the Aleutians tactically worthless. There was nothing there. No resources, no population centers, no strategic value, so why did Japan attack them? To this day, historians debate the answer. Some believe it was a fainter diversionary attack meant to draw American naval power away from Midway Island, where Japan was planning a massive carrier assault. Others think Japanese commanders genuinely planned to island hop through the Aleutians to Alaska, then invade mainland United States through Canada. Whatever the rationale, Japanese Admiral Kakuji Kakuta's task force approached the Aleutians in early June with aircraft carriers Riru and Juneau. Their target, Dutch Harbor on Unalaska Island, a critical American naval base, and among the pilots preparing for the attack was a 19-year-old named Tadayoshi Koga in his service photograph. Koga looks directly at the camera with the confident expression of a skilled pilot. His left hand is tucked casually into his uniform pocket. There's almost a hint of a smile. Why not? He was flying the finest fighter aircraft in the world. He was young, talented, and served an empire that seemed unstoppable. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, Koga strapped into his zero-tail number 4593 and launched from the Riru as part of a 3-plane section. His wingmen were Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo and Petty Officer Suguo Shikada. The mission was straightforward: provide fighter escort for bombers attacking Dutch Harbor, strafe targets of opportunity, eliminate any American aircraft that rose to challenge them. Koga, probably, expected to complete the mission and return to his carrier. In time for dinner, the attack began. As the Japanese formation emerged from the ubiquitous Aleutian fog, Dutch Harbor materialized below them: ships in the harbor, fuel storage tanks, military installations. The bombers descended. The Zeros prowled the sky. hunting for American fighters. That's when Koga's section spotted a PBY-5, a Catalina, flying boat piloted by Lieutenant Bud Mitchell. The lumbering patrol bomber didn't stand a chance. The 3 Zeros pounced. Their guns tore into the Catalina, killing Mitchell and all 6 crew members. The flying boat crashed into the harbor, but someone on the ground or aboard one of the American ships had gotten off a shot. Multiple shots, actually. Small arms, fire .50 caliber, rounds from anti-aircraft positions, and smaller caliber from rifles. One of those rounds found Koga's 0. It wasn't a catastrophic hit. No explosion, no critical control surface damage. Just a single bullet that severed the oil return line. For a split second, Koga might not have even noticed. Then he saw it. A dark stream of oil trailing from his aircraft, misting in the SLIP STREAM. Every pilot knows what that means. An oil leak in a radial engine is a death sentence. You have only as long as your oil reserve lasts. The moment the last drop escapes, metal begins grinding against metal. Temperatures spike. The engine seizes. And then you're flying a very expensive glider. Koga immediately reduced speed to minimize oil loss. His wingman formed up alongside him, watching the dark trail streaming from his aircraft. They knew he was in trouble. The question was, how much time did he have? Japanese protocols were clear. Okuten Island, about 25 miles east of Dutch Harbor, had been designated as an emergency landing site. A Japanese submarine lurched off the island's coast specifically to rescue downed pilots. Koga's section headed for Okuten, nursing the damaged Zero along, watching the oil pressure gauge drop with each passing minute. As Akutan emerged from the mist, Koga spotted exactly what he needed. A long, flat expanse covered in grass. It looked perfect for an emergency landing. A natural airstrip carved into the island's otherwise hostile terrain. His wingman circled above as Koga descended. They watched him lower his landing gear, watched him line up his approach. Everything looked textbook perfect, but that grassy field concealed a deadly secret. Beneath the grass lay boggy soil, saturated with water, soft as quicksand. The kind of terrain that looks solid but isn't. Koga's main wheels touched down. Immediately, the landing gear sank into the bog. The wheels caught, stopped, held fast. At 80 miles per hour, the Zero pitched forward and flipped end over end. It came to rest upside down, one wing crumpled, the propeller bent and buried in the mud. The tail pointed at the sky. Inside the inverted cockpit, Tadayoshi Koga hung lifeless in his restraints. His neck had snapped on impact. The 19-year-old pilot died instantly, probably never knowing he'd just handed the Allies the intelligence coup of the Pacific War. Above, Endo and Shikada circled the crash site in horror. Japanese pilots had standing orders. If a Zero crash lands in enemy territory, destroy it. Set it on fire. Strafe it until it's unrecognizable scrap metal. The Zero's secrets must never fall into Allied hands. But Koga's aircraft looked almost intact. The fuselage appeared undamaged. The wings, despite one being crumpled, were still attached. The engine was buried nose down. But otherwise, the plane seemed complete, and Endo and Shikada couldn't know if their friend was still alive inside that inverted cockpit. They circled once more, torn between duty and loyalty. If Koga was alive, strafing the aircraft would kill him. But if they didn't destroy it and it fell into American hands, In the end, they couldn't bring themselves to fire. They broke formation and headed back toward the Riru, hoping that either Koga had survived and would be rescued by the submarine, or that the Americans would never find the crash site. The submarine waited off Akutan's coast for 2 days, searching for Koga, finally depth-charged by the destroyer USS Williamson. It withdrew. Koga's Zero sat alone on Akutan Island, upside down in the mist, slowly settling into the bog. 1 month passed. The wreck remained undiscovered. Akutan was so remote, so worthless, that no one bothered to patrol it. The crash site was inland, out of sight from standard shipping lanes. Japanese command assumed the aircraft had been destroyed or was irretrievably. American command had no idea it existed. Then, on July 10th, APBY Catalina patrol bomber got lost. Lieutenant William Bill Thies and his crew had been navigating by dead reckoning when they became disoriented in the fog. When the Shumajin Islands finally appeared, Thies corrected his course and decided to take the most direct route back to Dutch Harbor Strait over Akutan Island. Machinist mate Albert Knack, serving as the plane captain, happened to glance down at exactly the right moment. "There's a plane down there." Thies circled back. Through breaks in the fog, they could see it clearly. A Japanese Zero, upside down, tail in the air, remote, alone, apparently intact. Thies marked the position on his map and radioed Dutch Harbor. What he'd just found was about to change the course of the war. The recovery operation was an exercise in persistence and near disaster. On July 11th, Thies returned with a salvage team. They landed the Catalina in the nearby bay and waded through the muck to reach the Zero. The first order of business: recover the pilot. Machinist mate Knack, the smallest crew member, crawled up inside the inverted cockpit and cut Koga's restraining harness with a knife. They pulled the young pilot's body free and buried him in a shallow grave near the crash site. The team searched the cockpit for intelligence materials, photographed everything, and reported back. The aircraft appeared salvageable. A second recovery team arrived on July 12th with equipment to move the Zero. They gave Koga a proper Christian burial in a small knoll overlooking the crash. A small gesture of respect for a fallen enemy pilot. Then they tried to extract the aircraft. Without proper heavy equipment, the effort failed. The Zero was mired too deeply. A third team arrived on July 15th, this time with the right gear. Working carefully, they freed the Zero from the bog and hauled it overland to a waiting barge without causing additional damage. The aircraft was transported to Dutch Harbor, flipped right side up, and cleaned. On August 1st, the USS St. Mihiel arrived in Seattle carrying the most valuable intelligence prize of the Pacific War. From Seattle, the Zero was transported to Naval Air Station North Island near San Diego. Engineers examined it with painstaking care. The damage was remarkably minimal: bent landing struts, a twisted vertical stabilizer, crumpled wingtips. Nothing that couldn't be repaired, but they had to work fast. And they had to work in absolute secrecy. 20-4-hour military police guards surrounded the aircraft. No photographs were allowed outside official channels. Souvenir hunters were threatened with court-martial. The Zero's red Hinomaru roundel was painted over with American insignia. Repair crews fabricated new landing struts. They straightened the vertical stabilizer, rudder, wingtips, and flaps. They dressed the three-blade Sumitomo propeller and reused it. The damage had looked dramatic, but most of it was superficial. On September 20th, 1942, just 2.5 months after Koga's final flight, the Zero was ready to fly again. Lieutenant Commander Eddie R. Sanders climbed into the cockpit, started the engine, and lifted off into California skies. For the first time, an American pilot was flying a Zero in American colors, and what Sanders discovered in the next 45 minutes would shatter the myth of Japanese invincibility. The very first test flight exposed what American had been desperate to learn for 2 years. The Zero had Achilles' heels. Multiple, exploitable, potentially war-changing Achilles' heels. Sanders' initial report was almost casual in tone, but its contents were revolutionary. Immediately apparent was the fact that the ailerons froze up at speeds above 200 knots, so that rolling maneuvers at those speeds were slow and required much force on the control stick. It rolled to the left much easier than to the right. Read that again. The most maneuverable fighter in the Pacific couldn't roll effectively at high speeds, and it rolled poorly to the right at any speed. This meant that an American pilot being chased by a Zero had a specific, reliable escape maneuver: dive to build up speed past 200 knots, then roll hard right. The Zero pilot, trying to follow, would find his controls sluggish and unresponsive. By the time the Zero could complete the roll, the American fighter would be gone. But there was more. The engine cut out under negative acceleration due to its float-type carburetor. Translation: if you pushed the Zero into a dive with negative G-forces, the engine would sputter and quit. The float-type carburetor couldn't handle negative G-loads. Fuel would slosh away from the intake, and the engine would starve. So the complete escape maneuver became: dive with negative G to make the Zero's engine quit, build speed past 200 knots, then roll hard right while the Zero pilot was still struggling with a dead engine and frozen ailerons. Sanders flew 24 test flights in 25 days. Each flight revealed more weaknesses. The Zero was phenomenal in a slow-speed turning fight, but American pilots now knew never to engage in a slow-speed turning fight. Instead, use speed, use altitude, use power, hit and run. Never try to outturn a Zero, outspeed it, outmuscle it. After Sanders' initial tests, the Zero was transferred to Anacostia Naval Air Station near Washington, D.C. The Navy wanted more sophisticated analysis, so the aircraft was flown to the NACA Langley Research Center in March 1943 at Langley. The Zero underwent wind tunnel testing under conditions of strict secrecy. Engineers measured lift, drag, control effectiveness, and sideslip characteristics. They documented everything. Then came the dogfight simulations. Frederick M. Trapnell, director of flight testing at Anacostia, took the Zero up against the newest American fighters. Sanders flew American aircraft while Trapnell flew the Zero, simulating aerial combat. Later, test pilot Lieutenant Melvin C. Boogie Hoffman conducted more realistic trials, flying the Zero against newly commissioned Navy pilots flying F-6F, Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs. The results were compiled into classified reports, distributed to fighter squadrons across the Pacific. Every American pilot received specific instructions. Here's what the Zero can do. Here's what it can't do. Here's how to kill it. Did the captured Zero influence the design of American fighters? Historians debate this fiercely. The F-6F Hellcat was already under development when Koga Zero was recovered, but the test flights absolutely influenced tactics. And in aerial combat, tactics matter as much as technology. Marine Captain Kenneth Walsh, who finished the war with 17 aerial victories over Zeros, described how the intelligence from Koga's aircraft saved his life multiple times with a Zero on my tail. I did a split S, and with its nose down and full throttle, my Corsair picked up speed fast. I wanted at least 240 knots, preferably 260. Then, as prescribed, I rolled hard right. Tracers from the Zero zinged past my plane's belly. From information that came from Koga Zero, I knew the Zero rolled more slowly to the right than to the left. If I hadn't known which way to turn or roll, I'd have probably rolled to my left. If I had done that, the Zero would likely have turned with me, locked on, and had me. I used that maneuver a number of times to get away from Zeros. Another ace, our Robert Porter, credited the same intelligence with his survival. Flying ace William N. Leonard called the captured Zero a treasure. To my knowledge, no other captured machine has ever unlocked so many secrets at a time when the need was so great. The Japanese, eventually, learned what had happened. Japanese historian and Air Self-Defense Force Lieutenant General Masatake Okamiya, who led Zero squadrons during the war, later wrote that the capture of the Okutan Zero was no less serious than the Japanese defeat at Midway, and did much to hasten Japan's final defeat. Think about that statement. A Japanese general, a man who flew Zeros in combat, equating the loss of one aircraft with the loss of 4 fleet carriers and the turning point of the Pacific War. Was he exaggerating? Consider what happened in the months and years following September 1942, when American pilots first learned the Zero's secrets, in 1942, before the intelligence from Koga Zero was widely disseminated. Japanese Zeros maintained kill ratios that sometimes reached 12-1 in their favor. American pilots faced them with a mix of obsolete fighters and tactics that didn't work. By mid-1943, after the tactical information had spread throughout American fighter squadrons, those kill ratios reversed. F-6F Hellcats were achieving 13-1 kill ratios against Zeros. The Corsair, using the exact high-speed diving and rolling tactics discovered through testing Koga's aircraft, dominated in every engagement. In February 1944 alone, the Luftwaffe lost 33% of its fighter pilots, but in the Pacific, Japanese Zero squadrons were suffering similar attrition rates, and unlike Germany, Japan couldn't replace its experienced pilots. The training pipeline had collapsed. New pilots were being sent to combat with minimal flight hours, facing American aviators who now knew exactly how to exploit every weakness in Japanese fighter design. The psychological impact was almost as devastating as the tactical one. For 2 years, the Zero had been invincible. Now it was vulnerable. Japanese pilots who had flown with confidence, knowing their aircraft was superior, found themselves hunted by American fighters that refused to dogfight and instead used speed and power. The 2 areas where the Zero was weakest, Japanese engineers knew about these weaknesses. They'd known since 1940, but the Zero's design philosophy, extreme range and maneuverability, at all costs had locked them into a design that couldn't be fixed without fundamentally compromising what made the Zero effective in the first place. To add armor plating would reduce range and maneuverability. To install self-sealing fuel tanks would add weight. To strengthen the airframe for high-speed maneuvers would make it heavier still. Every fix would turn the Zero into something else, a different aircraft, one that Japan's limited industrial capacity couldn't produce in sufficient numbers, so the Zero remained in production, largely unchanged, for the entire war. 10,500 Zeros were manufactured, and as American pilots learned to counter them, those Zeros became flying coffins. By 1944, the mighty Zero, the fighter that had dominated the Pacific skies, that had shot down Chennault's fighters over China, that had devastated British hurricanes over Salonhead, been reduced to one final mission, kamikaze. When you can't win in aerial combat, when your pilots are poorly trained and your aircraft is obsolete, you make your fighters into missiles. The Zero, once a symbol of Japanese air superiority, became a symbol of Japanese desperation, and it all traced back to a muddy bog on a forgotten island in the Aleutians, where a 19-year-old pilot named Tadayoshi Koga died in a crash landing that should have been survivable. But what about that other incident? Those Japanese pilots circling the USS Yorktown in the darkness, trying to land on an enemy carrier. On the surface, it seems like a bizarre footnote, strange story with no real consequence. But look deeper. That incident on May 7th, 1942, revealed something American intelligence officers had been slow to recognize. Japanese pilots, despite their superior training and superior aircraft, were human. They made mistakes. They got disoriented. They could be confused in the chaos of battle. This understanding that the enemy was fallible began to erode the psychological advantage Japan had built through 2 years of victories. Consider the timeline. May 7th, the Yorktown incident. June 4th, Koga's crash landing. June 4th to 7th, the Battle of Midway, where American dive bombers caught for Japanese carriers with aircraft on deck refueling and destroyed the core of Japan's carrier fleet, all within 1 month. And all of these events shared a common thread: Japanese forces making critical mistakes at exactly the wrong moment. The pilots trying to land on the Yorktown were lost, disoriented, running low on fuel. They made a navigational error that could have been catastrophic if they'd actually succeeded in landing. Imagine Japanese bombers on the deck of an American carrier, their pilots realizing too late where they were, unable to take off again. They would have been captured alive, along with their aircraft, their codebooks, their intelligence materials. That didn't happen, but it nearly did. And the fact that it nearly happened showed American naval intelligence something important. Japanese operational security wasn't perfect. Japanese navigation wasn't infallible. Japanese pilots could be pushed to the point where they made desperate, fatal decisions. Koga's decision to attempt a landing on Okutan Island was another one of those desperate moments. He had no good options. Ditch in the ocean and hope for submarine rescue. Risk running out of oil and having the engine seize at altitude. Or try for the emergency landing field. He chose the landing. The gear-down landing that looked safe, but wasn't. Another mistake in a month full of Japanese mistakes. And that's the deeper story here. It's not just about one captured Zero or one near landing on an enemy carrier. It's about the moment when Japan's string of victories began to unravel, when the psychological advantage began to shift, when American forces started to really believe that Japan could be beaten. The intelligence from Koga Zero gave American pilots the tools to win, but the Yorktown incident, in its own way, gave them something equally valuable: the knowledge that their enemy wasn't superhuman. In 1943, the captured Zero was put on display at Washington National Airport as a war prize. Thousands of Americans lined up to see the enemy fighter that had dominated the Pacific skies. They walked around it, touched it, took photographs. The mystique was gone. In 1944, the Zero was recalled to North Island for use as a training aircraft. Rookie pilots preparing for deployment to the Pacific sat in the cockpit, learned its controls, understood its limitations. They went into combat knowing their enemy better than the enemy knew himself. And then, in February 1945, Koga's Zero met an inglorious end. The aircraft was taxiing for a training flight when a Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver lost control and crashed into it. The Helldiver's propeller sliced through the Zero's fuselage, cutting it to pieces. The aircraft that had been called a prize almost beyond value to the United States was destroyed in a stupid, preventable accident on a California airfield. But by then, it didn't matter. The Zero's secrets had been learnt, documented, distributed, and exploited. The damage was done. Pieces of the aircraft were salvaged and distributed to museums. The National Museum of the United States Navy received several gauges that William N. Leonard had saved from the wreckage. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum and the Alaska Heritage Museum received small fragments. That's all that remains of the most consequential intelligence capture of the Pacific War. As for the people involved in these two incidents, their fates varied wildly. The Japanese pilots who tried to land on the Yorktown escaped into the night and returned to their carriers. We don't know their names. We don't know if they survived the war. Japanese records from the Battle of the Coral Sea don't specifically identify them, and they likely never reported the incident. Imagine explaining to your commanding officer that you nearly landed on an enemy carrier. The Yorktown itself survived the Coral Sea, limped back to Pearl Harbor with bomb damage, and was patched up in an amazing 72-hour emergency repair effort. The carrier then sailed to Midway, where it played a crucial role in the destruction of the Japanese carrier fleet before being torpedoed by submarine I-168 and sinking on June 7, 1942. Many of the Yorktown's crew survived and were reassigned to other ships. Some of them probably told the story of the Japanese pilots trying to land on their deck, though it was rarely believed. Lieutenant William Bill Thies, the pilot who discovered Koga's Zero, went on to command PBY Catalina squadrons throughout the war. He later rose to the rank of Rear Admiral. In interviews years later, he always maintained that spotting the Zero had been pure luck. He'd been lost in the fog and just happened to fly over Okatan at exactly the right moment. Machinist mate Albert Knack, who crawled into the inverted cockpit to cut Koga's body free, returned to civilian life after the war and rarely spoke about the incident. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders, the first American to fly the captured Zero, continued as a test pilot and made crucial contributions to fighter development throughout the war. His 24 test flights in Koga's Zero remained classified for years. Frederick M. Trapnell, who conducted the comparative dogfight tests, became known as the godfather of naval aviation. He survived a horrific crash in 1944 that left him severely burned and disfigured, but he continued to fly and test aircraft. He retired as a Rear Admiral and died in 1975, having shaped an entire generation of American carrier aviation. The Japanese wingman who circled Koga's crash site, Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo and Petty Officer Sugao Shikado, both survived the war. Shikada published an account in 1984 where he claimed the damage to Koga's plane occurred during a different attack and omitted any mention of shooting down the American PBY Catalina and strafing survivors in the water. His account contradicted both American and Japanese records. Author Jim Reardon noted that it seems likely that in the near half-century after the event, Shikada's memory confused the raids of June 3rd and June 4th. It also seems likely that Shikada employed selective memory in not mentioning shooting down Mitchell's PBY, the psychological burden of leaving Koga's aircraft intact, knowing they had violated standing orders but unable to fire on their friend, must have been immense. And when they learned, years later, that the aircraft had been captured and used against Japan, that burden must have become unbearable. As for Tadayoshi Koga, his story has one final melancholy chapter. American author Jim Reardon led a search expedition to Okuten in 1988, attempting to repatriate Koga's remains to Japan. He located the gravesite on the small knoll overlooking the crash location. The grave was empty. Further research revealed that an American Graves Registration Service team had exhumed the body in 1947 and transported it to a cemetery on Adak Island, further down the Aleutian chain. The team hadn't been able to identify the remains, so Koga's body was marked as unknown in 1953. The Adak cemetery was excavated and 236 bodies were returned to Japan. 13 were identified, including Koga's wingman, Shigeyoshi Shindo, who had been buried next to him. The remaining 223 unidentified remains, almost certainly including Koga, were cremated and interred in Chidruga-Fuchi National Cemetery in Tokyo. So Koga did return home, in a sense, just not with his name, not with recognition, not with honor. He rests in a collective grave with hundreds of other unidentified Japanese war dead. His identity lost to history except for those who study the Pacific War and know the story of the Zero that changed everything. It's a strange kind of fame. Koga is remembered in America more than in Japan. American museums display pieces of his aircraft. American historians write about his final flight. American veterans credit his inadvertent gift with saving their lives. But in Japan, he's just one more name among millions lost in a war that Japan would rather forget. The broader consequences of these incidents rippled through the rest of the Pacific. War by late 1943. American fighter tactics had evolved to specifically counter the Zero's strengths while exploiting its weaknesses. The thatch weave, a defensive maneuver where two fighters covered each other in scissoring. Turns prevented Zeros from using their superior turning ability. High-speed boom and zoom attacks let American fighters use their power and diving speed while avoiding slow-speed dogfights. The F-6F Hellcat, entering service in early 1943, was specifically designed to match American tactical doctrine against the Zero. It couldn't outturn a Zero, but it didn't need to. It could outdive it, outspeed it, outmuscle it, and it had armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks that kept American pilots alive when they took hits. The Hellcat's combat record speaks for itself. 5,223 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat while losing only 270 Hellcats to enemy fighters. A 19-to-1 kill ratio. The Corsair achieved similar results. Both aircraft were flown by pilots who'd been trained using intelligence derived from Koga Zero. They knew the escape maneuvers. They knew the speed thresholds. They knew to roll right, not left. And they knew the Zero was BEATABL. By 1945, the psychological transformation was complete. American pilots who once fled from Zeros now hunted them. Japanese pilots who once dominated the skies now faced opponents who understood their aircraft better than they did themselves. The myth of invincibility was shattered. not through propaganda or wishful thinking, but through hard technical intelligence derived from two accidents: one aircraft that tried to land where it shouldn't, and one aircraft that actually did land where it couldn't escape. There's a broader lesson in these two stories. Beyond the tactics and the technology, intelligence wins wars. Not just intelligence from spies and codebreakers, but intelligence from accidents, from lucky breaks, from enemy mistakes that observant people notice and exploit. The Yorktown incident could have been dismissed as a weird anomaly, a strange story to tell over beers, but nothing more. Instead, American naval intelligence logged it, analyzed it, and added it to their understanding of Japanese operational procedures. It became one more data point showing that Japanese forces could be confused, disoriented, and vulnerable. Koga's Zero could have been destroyed by his wingman, following orders. Or it could have been lost in the fog and never recovered. Or it could have been found but so badly damaged it couldn't be restored. Any of a dozen things could have prevented it from falling into American hands intact. But it did fall into American hands. And when it did, the Americans didn't just look at it, they flew it. They tested it. They measured it. They simulated combat with it. They documented everything and distributed that knowledge to every fighter. Squadron in the Pacific. That's the difference between discovering something useful and actually using it. Japan knew the Zero's weaknesses. Japanese engineers had known since 1940 that the aircraft lacked armor, couldn't handle high-speed maneuvers, and had a problematic carburetor. But Japan's industrial capacity was limited, and changing the Zero's design would have meant retooling factories and accepting reduced production numbers. So they kept building the same aircraft with the same flaws throughout the entire war. The United States, by contrast, turned one captured aircraft into a systematic program of tactical development. Every weakness was analyzed, every counter-tactic was tested, every lesson was taught to pilots before they entered combat. That's the advantage of an industrial democracy with strong institutions and good information sharing. When you learn something valuable, you don't keep it secret, you spread it as widely and as quickly as possible. Both of these incidents, the near landing on the Yorktown and the capture of Koga's Zero, shared one more thing in common. They were accidents that became turning points. The Japanese pilots trying to land on the Yorktown weren't attempting a daring infiltration. They were lost, confused, and desperate. Their mistake revealed vulnerabilities in Japanese training and navigation. Koga didn't crash land on Okutan as part of some clever defection plan. He was hit by ground fire, tried to save his aircraft, and died when the landing went wrong. His mistake handed the Allies the intelligence treasure of the Pacific War. Neither incident was planned. Neither was intended. Both were the result of chaos, confusion, and the unpredictable nature of warfare. And yet both changed history when Japanese analysts later assessed what went wrong in the Pacific War. They identified strategic mistakes, industrial shortcomings, and resource limitations. Masatake Okamiya specifically called out the capture of Koga's Zero as being as significant as the defeat at Midway. A 19-year-old pilot's final moments, captured in an inverted aircraft on a foggy island, helped defeat an empire, and somewhere in the darkness of the Coral Sea, 3 Japanese pilots who nearly landed on an American carrier flew away not knowing they'd revealed just how fallible their seemingly invincible forces really were. Sometimes history turns on grand strategies and decisive battles. Sometimes it turns on accidents in the fog and mistakes that someone, somewhere, was paying attention to. The Americans were paying attention, And that made all the difference.